development, but most importantly, building bridges in between global governance and business and academia and civil society around SDG acceleration. Mostly trying to foster exponential innovation around themes such as the acceleration of the finance paradigm shift towards sustainability and governance of technology around this issue of linking technological management with AI and ethics here in Geneva. So that's what I'm doing.
That's exciting. Do you have any? I mean, I'm kind of based in Japan, so do you have any contacts with Japan? Is Japan part of what you're doing?
I have been working a lot with the Japanese government. At the time I was negotiating and chairing trade negotiations at the World Trade Organization. And I have had contacts with the Tokyo Financial Center recently because we have started an initiative here. I'm going to talk about that a bit later when I intervene. I think at around 8.
Yes,
I lose the notion of time. It's night time here in Europe. We have launched this concept here called Building Bridges Week, which brings together global governance and sustainable finance actors worldwide to essentially accelerate the diffusion of sustainable finance, but also impact finance, blended finance, and so it's a bit like a mini Davos of financial transformation here in Geneva. And the second edition of this movement is going to happen this November in town. So that's probably the most relevant issue here when it comes to finance, and fintech is obviously going to be a big player because technology here as well is going to change the way we do things very clearly, and it's already happening. The disruption is happening each and every day, and we try to harness it, make sure green fintech, but also the whole question around ESG measurement is taken really very seriously indeed. So that's where we are. How do you look at, how do you measure Japan's sort of take on sustainable finance? Is there an active movement there? Is it huge?
Yeah, thanks, Nicholas. That's and hi James. That's precisely what the two of us, a partner, Mizue, will be talking about. She pioneered SRI and ESG investment in Japan starting way back in the 90s, and she'll be saying it's an uphill battle. And but recently words like green and SDG seem to resonate much more easily with government and business, and she'll try and kind of talk about that. So SRI ESG are what's the word, a brick balloon or something. I mean, they don't fly. Partly also because I don't think in Japan that there's a tendency that they don't like being advised what to do. It needs to kind of grow from within somewhere, and somehow green and the SDGs has been something they can latch onto much more easily, and certainly seem to mean to create investment projects in a way that ESG and SRI never did. Obviously, that's a lot to do with government initiatives, and I'm sure some of the people you've been meeting, the government's promoting green bonds, and they're being pushed by most of the big investment banks as well. And that's really where most of the money is going, not so much in terms of impact investment. That's low, small scale stuff remains difficult to fly. But if you've got a big scheme in Singapore or anywhere, for sort of rebuilding a city or something, Japanese investment will follow it, and in terms of green and the SDGs.
It's interesting. The picture is really contrasted in Asia.
Yeah.
I've had like 2.5 years ago, Geneva competed with several other financial centers in the world to welcome what we call nowadays FC4S, the global network of financial centers for sustainability, which is an interesting concept created at the time by the G7, and which is now housed here in Geneva. I negotiated its arrival to town here. And at the time, Tokyo was sort of looking into this with interest, I think, for sure. But there hasn't been a passion, if I can speak that way, as much as there has been typically in China. The finalist against I was sort of having to compete against to welcome this organization to town was typically Shanghai. Other Asian centers, including China, were very active as well. Shenzhen, for instance. Needless to say, Kuala Lumpur was in the loop, and a few other places were really, really competing here to sort of like position themselves at the forefront of things. It seems that move will happen, but I think there is a more prudent approach in Japan.
Yeah, I think Japan also changed enormously when the famous Japanese bubble imploded or exploded, and that's like 30 years ago. And people talked about Japan's lost a decade. It's really lost three decades. So that still is the climate. It remains very conservative, and I mean, there may well be other stuff going on, but it's conservative is certainly the word you hear.
It's almost an understatement.
Yeah, and certainly the investment bankers I speak to who operate in Asia and in Japan say Japan is just a very different world. Yeah. And it's all about 2% and 3%, whereas in Asia people are talking about if it's not 20%, there's something wrong. It's a very
James, I would love you to welcome yourself, introduce yourself, and feel free to join in the conversation. We're just, as you can tell, debating the different attitudes and approaches to ESG all over Asia.
Yeah, there are certainly a lot of different approaches. Speaking of Shenzhen, I lived there for 6 years until just a couple of years ago, so very familiar with that market. Although I was in the telecommunications world as a VP for trade and investment for Huawei. So with Huawei, they've been dabbling in the financial and fintech world, but still based mostly in their telecommunications. But in any event. Out of Shenzhen. I don't know that there's a lot of what you would call faith-based investment coming out of Shenzhen. That's a whole other topic. But there's certainly a lot of return-driven investment and market share-driven investment coming out of China, and a tsunami of Chinese investment for a good 10 years now, really.
Absolutely, in the sense that sometimes it's the family offices, so it may not be overtly faith-based, but there's sometimes the motivation is beyond just returns. I mean, I don't know to what extent it's, as Market, our CEO, knows very well, and we're kind of getting to know it through him, but yes.
Yeah, I certainly find in Japan that it's okay to talk about values, preferably Japanese values, but even the religious organizations themselves won't say we have any special values. Like maybe the Buddhist groups will talk about peace, and that's where it stops. And certainly, if you go to their finance offices that for a religious group or a religious university, you won't find anybody religious in the finance office. That's the one area that's it's the black box, and they let them get on with it. But I'll be talking about some of that later as well.
I think what's fascinating here is really what I observe talking with all of the big finance and also the smaller players here in Switzerland, not just in Geneva, is really there has now been this understanding that this is probably impact financing and ESG is really the next big opportunity we are going to face, and it's to a certain extent here. I think there is a bit of an understanding that this is a bit of a to be or not to be moment for finance. First of all, regulation is changing. Second of all, we all have to change the way we live and we invest, and because the challenges we are facing are just absolutely staggering, and the climate change element really will play out big time in the years to come. And third, I think really what we see more and more is investors, both at the sort of like institutional and personal level, are asking for these products big time now. There is an enormous amount of demand. And unless you position yourself as a boutique or as a large firm, you really lose opportunities to grow. And so I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this is shaping the competition internationally. But we feel very strongly, very strongly, that this is the trend on which we need to be very sort of aggressively positive, if I can say so. So and that's great, because I feel we have an alignment here between purpose and profit, which is what we should really push for. That's what we have missed in the past, and that's, I think, where we are going. That's very positive in my opinion.
Yeah, my take on is things like the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and other kind of global trade networks. And the fear in Japan would certainly be, well, okay, if we raise our ecological standards or ESG or whatever, they'll see that in terms of making things more expensive. And somewhere else, Vietnam or somewhere, will just do things the old way and cheaply, and Japanese will buy foreign because it's just cheaper. So how do we handle that kind of thing? I mean, in Japan, certainly the government they use this phrase value added. That if it's organic food or something with a nice label on saying it's not battery chickens or something, the price will be 2 or 3 times the ordinary, and it's a profit mechanism. It's a way of raising more money rather than raising standards. What do we do about that?
To me here, the response is really, first of all, at the WTO and within free trade agreement discussions, these themes are becoming more and more prevalent. At the WTO, we now have, since I think Monday this week, we have a new Director General from Nigeria, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala from Nigeria. Yeah. She really is understanding these sort of things.
With a financial background as well, yeah.
Yeah. She was at World Bank, absolutely, James. And then she's been the chairwoman of Gavi, which is particularly interesting at this juncture, because she obviously has been in charge of the whole sort of global rollout of vaccine, the COVAX scheme, as we call it here, before she took over the position at the WTO. But more generally, really on sustainability, this discussion has been happening at the WTO for quite some time. I happened in a previous life from 2002 to 2013 to be a senior Swiss negotiator at the WTO and chairing negotiation processes there, especially during the second sort of the phase of my presence there. And typically, and to give you a very concrete example, government procurement, huge amounts of money. The government procurement agreement of the WTO, so how states buy goods and services to function, think infrastructure, schools, whatever, hospitals, energy infrastructure, whatever. The discussion already at the time I was leading this process from 2007 to 2012, the discussions were really focused on obviously transparency, obviously anti-corruption, but the third really big pillar that came up was, how do we get moving forward with green procurement, with social procurement, so that the ESG element was already in the discussions. And I remember at the very end of the negotiations, there had been this breakthrough where we all agreed that this was a theme we would have to dig deeper into. You spoke about the TPP and how sort of a certain number of countries fear that this might make their products more expensive. On the other side, consumers do request governments to step up on this. We typically now, Switzerland, when we enter free trade agreements, there is a chapter that we always put in on sustainability. And I've seen more and more countries insisting on these elements, and that will have to be taken up by states more and more around the globe. So yes, obviously there are fears around sort of this making producers products more expensive, but very clearly it is going to become a standard, because the regulators on the other side are also going to move forward on this. We have people here in Geneva at ISO, the International Standardization Organization, which are sort of looking into this. Just recently, I spoke with my counterpart, the Deputy Secretary General there. Very clearly, this is in the cards now. It's something that's discussed. So there is an evolution happening, and I think the trade world, and I have no doubt Ngozi is gonna really put this more forcefully on the agenda. It's a member-driven organization for sure, the WTO, but more and more members are going to demand more action on this. So I'm again, I think at the end of the day, it's going to be a question: are you sort of like at the forefront of the trend? A trendsetter, or are you sort of like following this? And my take in a world which changes super fast is there is a bit of a premium on being ahead of the curve rather than behind. That's just how I look at things.
There's a reality about governments as well, and I've been deeply involved in the WTO for 30 years myself. Learned about GATT back in the old Tokyo round, actually, and I'm a lawyer, international lawyer by background, so I was active in all of that. Gave keynotes for things like the International Technology Agreement with our last Director General. But as much as I love the WTO and all of that, governments are usually 3 to 5 years behind business, and they're trying to catch up from a regulatory standpoint to where business has already gone and where businesses sort of highlighted things. And with financial and fintech right now, and I'm more speaking not as a former trade negotiator and a trade lawyer, but more now as a business person, because I'm consulting CEOs who want to do cross-border investment, and just finished with one that got invested in an Israeli company that's doing artificial intelligence and sort of blockchain-related developments. None of that is regulated yet, and to an extent, except that it's regulated by outdated rules. So we have, whatever, you're trying to do the digital economy with non-digital rules. So it's and that's true in the whole digital economy, but no more so than in the financial and fintech. But I was also a founder of the International Christian Chamber of Commerce a couple of decades ago, and so got a lot of people around the world who are really interested in how to get into this area and do it in a way that's consistent with their values. So we have, I think, Michael, you were talking about institutional investors, but there's also just the private investors. There's also the people that just want to grow a business. So there's a couple of different layers, and I can certainly foresee with government not having caught up to this area probably for 5 years from now. And then they're usually regulating what happened 3 years ago and not where we are now, as we all know. Where are those opportunities? In Asia, I guess technically the one I just did in Israel. Israel is the outer limits of Asia, I suppose, right? So the far western border on the Mediterranean. But I think within Asia, of course, there's outbound investment in fintech and financial from Asia. A lot of Chinese, a lot of Japanese. Singapore, of course, is the hub of the South in the financial world. KL, Vietnam has been increasingly active. Thailand, sort of recovering from the disruptions. Indonesia, I lived in Indonesia for 4 years as well. It's another big economy with a lot of opportunities. So I'm looking at it from a couple of standpoints. I mean, I've got a traditional background. I've also got a faith-based group that I represent from around the world, but I also have my own clients who are CEOs of companies wanting to go global or already going global. So this area is particularly fascinating for me. Nana, yeah.
James, yeah, no, it's interesting just picking up on the last thing you said in terms of opportunities in Indonesia. So maybe not from a Christian perspective, but from a Hindu perspective, we're connected to the Muslim Union of Indonesia. Mm-hmm. And one of the, obviously with our focus, so I'm from Faith Invest, and with our focus on the investment side, the challenge that they're trying to deal with is the fact that the traditional required religious contributions aren't coming through because, as you say, they don't trust government to invest these things properly. The managers don't have capacity. So they're kind of saying, can we skip everything and just do blockchain type solutions so we can follow the money directly without intermediaries and other people, and see that when we give our zakat, our 2.5% is going to what we care about. When we buy our land or we put our money into WACF, it's going into what we care about. So it's interesting in the sense that, I mean, it's raising questions for us as to, are we trying to be too traditional in the kind of a step-by-step approach versus just skipping the whole institutional barrier and letting people have really direct access and influence on what they want to do, genuinely driven by their values and not kind of interrupted by structures in the meantime.
So, well, and it's peer-to-peer, and
exactly,
and with the blockchain being peer-to-peer, there's actually a fascinating future I think that needs to be explored. It's because you could build a blockchain within a faith structure, and you'd have trusted people on both sides that wouldn't need the interference of third parties, whether they're banks or governments or anybody else. So, I mean, this. And there's money to be made by doing that as well. So we're talking about investment. There's the people that create such a structure that people could actually trust and would be value driven. There would be a value to that would have an ROI on the end of it, right?
Absolutely. No, it's nice to meet somebody who could actually move our thinking forward on that, because we're very much a level 101. So
yeah, I don't know. I mean, speaking from Japan, I'm sure that in government and elsewhere there's enormous suspicion of blockchain, and I think economists, everybody's familiar with how governments can kickstart economic development in a country. We have the stories of what happened in just Japan, South Korea, and China. But we seem to be at a stage now where those models aren't really working. The new economy, the internet, digital information economy is moving so fast, and I think governments are simply afraid because this is out of our control, and they don't like it. So I don't know. I mean, for me in Japan, and maybe Faith Invest in general, we need different conversations with governments and with you guys and so on. Just to give one example, you probably know that the very elderly but ex-Prime Minister Mori, who was running the Olympic sort of committee in Japan, got essentially fired for saying some stupid things about women. But behind the scenes, it was basically the decision of Toyota that's also on the committee to say, this kind of thinking is out of date. We don't want it. And it was, if you like, the sort of economic leaders telling the political leaders to back off. And that actually is quite a sea change for Japan. Mori was a giant, albeit elderly and a bit fuzzy in his thinking, but very much a strong player.
Very true, and I think a lot of the politicians confuse blockchain and Bitcoin, and there's sort of a stigma connected to Bitcoin, candidly, my wife and I invested in Bitcoin in 2014, so we have our own happy little story in that world. But the difference, it's like night and day. I mean, Bitcoin is just one of the early manifestations of the blockchain, but the blockchain itself could cut out a lot of middlemen and facilitate everything from real estate to anything that needs a database can use a blockchain and do it much more efficiently. So, I think probably this is a good example of what I was saying earlier. Industry is usually well ahead of government, and government still is trying to understand what is a blockchain, and they're using the fear factor of Bitcoin as a reason to try to slow down the blockchain. And the rest of us are not going to slow down on using the blockchain because it is the future, and the future is now. So the sorry answer for government is actually there's very little way for them to regulate the blockchain because it's a technology that it is basically neutral. There are bad people that use the blockchain just like there are bad people that use dollars, euros, and everything else. So that sort of excuse needs to be sort of shoved aside. And I think there probably is a role for, again, in the context of us as faith-based communities of saying, well, let's try to find the good uses for blockchain. Obviously we can find areas where it would be, a nice PR role, but there are far more deeper roles with the blockchain in terms of corporate structure. You can do everything from real estate closures to databases to, financial transactions, you name it. It's pretty much everything. And 10 years from now, it will be substantially everything, whether the government regulates it or not. So, but I think there's a role here for us in the faith community to try to have government, identify things that are good that we could invest in, and in an Asian or African or European or American, whatever context, work together on those things and educate the government, perhaps like you said, Michael, to stay out, because it might actually be the kindest thing that we could do. And then, Nicholas, we can come back to Geneva 10 years from now and negotiate an international blockchain agreement. under the
Well, I mean,
WTO, right?
yeah, you underestimate government, James. We are using blockchain ourselves
I know.
at the moment. We have started using it for a certain number of services we do for citizens, and we obviously follow this very closely. Especially, we even have started some sort of a public-private partnership with the trading network here in Geneva to essentially use blockchain-based solutions to accelerate transactions and to make sure smart contracts are essentially used to speed up things. It's part of what we believe is fundamentally important to remain competitive here within this network. But more importantly, to come back to international organizations, the WTO has now also a blockchain specialist, somebody who's making the link between the technology and how it's used and trade agreements as they exist. So yeah, people are sort of, catching up here in government as well. But you're right.
And there was a lot of good work done in the e-commerce negotiations, which I was also involved in over the years. So yeah.
The other thing which I agree with you fundamentally is indeed there is a movement towards decentralization, to decentralized governance, which is pretty clearly accelerated with blockchain. But at the end of the day, as always, it's a technology, and the way you use it depends really on what we sort of focus on. But you're right. I mean, especially on the tokenization side, the capacity of people to really get into this space to open up typically the capacity to invest. There is an inequality reduction potential that we haven't really explored that much, and which could be very interesting in the future, especially when it comes to the faith, the link with faith investments. That's a huge opportunity, and we are still at the very beginning of it, in my opinion.
Well, in many faith-based people, again, the hottest trend in the financial and fintech area right now is DeFi, DEFI, decentralized finance. And, I think a lot of faith-based people sort of like the idea of things being decentralized and not controlled. They actually like, as Anana was saying, they'd love to have it be within their own remit and not subject to external controls, except where needed, in the usual understanding of law. So, it's just a fascinating period, and I think with that decentralization, again, a good thing that the private sector and the faith-based community could do would be to be active and tell government, this is a good place where we need regulation broadly, soft regulation, the parameters without slowing us down, and, perhaps saying what areas wouldn't be necessarily so good. I'm more excited about what the private sector could do here, and where our targets over the next 2 to 5 years would lie in a fast-moving sector.
James, I'm also interested just to pick up your comment on the ICC and how that network institution, I don't know how you describe yourselves as a National Christian.
It's an NGO, that's a non-profit, yeah.
Yes, and just kind of in terms of the conversations that are happening there, what's the direction? Because I mean, obviously we're an NGO as well. They've been almost a sense of this conference is that they've been conversations in many places, in many different ways for a while. What is it going to take to translate conversations to investment at scale?
Yeah, at scale is another issue, and some people are looking about pooling into larger investment pools, and then there's individual corporate members. The International Christian Chamber of Commerce is in about 70 different countries, and so we, and now in operation for 35 years. So, we have a lot of membership in Asia, in Africa, Europe, North America, South America, pretty much the globe. Just thinking, I don't know statistically, I could find out, but probably, everybody uses banking. I was in meeting our friends in Kenya and Uganda a year ago before we were locked down, they, like in China, where I was very familiar, all their banking is done on their phone, right? And we're moving more and more to that e-banking. So we have, there's opportunities and there's threats, and winners and losers in a massive technological shift like we're going to face. And then there's people that are afraid. So within our faith, broadly speaking, that Christian faith-based community, there are concerns about where the technology is taking us and where that could go. But there's also excitement about an era that allows us to collaborate in really exciting new ways. So, I was talking with the Kenyans. The Kenyans are probably some of the leaders in the world on an economy that is based on decentralized finance. And China is probably the leading example in the world. That's sort of a scary thought for a lot of people. But even 5 years ago, when I was still living, I lived there for 6 years. I left 2.5 years ago. But you could do everything on WeChat. You just you go to McDonald's and flash your phone, and you would pay it, and you're out the door. Try to do that in North America, even with Apple Pay, you can't. So, and it would be great for more influence. That's disruptive for the Visas and the MasterCards and all the credit card companies and the banks who are scared to death of people doing peer-to-peer financial transfers. I'm just excited about the fact that I'd love to see some creativity in the faith-based community that would be able to move into this sector and do it in a credible, reliable, ethical way that could be really based on trust. So, that's the exciting area for me.
I think you just mentioned a key word, James, trust. With so much of our digital lives, moving into the digital sphere, very clearly we have to revisit this notion of trust and to strengthen it. You spoke about people being afraid, and people are sort of also left behind. The digital divide is just gigantic.
Yeah.
And so there is an enormous amount of work that needs to be done on cybersecurity, on creating that trust basis for people to get into these spheres, and also on cyber resilience, because attacks are going to just become much more prevalent. And so it's not going to be, whether we are sort of threatened by attacks, by criminality on the digital front. It's going to be how do we sort of like stand up again and get going again. That's why, and again, I think neither the private, and we've had some fascinating discussions here with Microsoft, with Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, who really is a big believer in how technology has a special responsibility that goes with the opportunity as well. And we had this discussion with again, typically it's an interesting case because it's not just the private sector, it's the private sector and the public sector talking together about like creating, and he came up with this idea, not us, about creating a Geneva Digital Convention 3 years ago, sort of saying, well, I mean, we have a Geneva Convention about humanitarian issues and warfare, rules of warfare. What about the digital sphere? And interestingly, some of the players here, especially the Red Cross, sort of said, well, no, because we feel that the Geneva Convention, obviously it's been made at the time when the digital world didn't exist, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't cover it as it stands. So Brad Smith kept on thinking about these things and came up with this idea of creating a Cyber Peace Institute to think about these developments and how essentially governance, and the private sector could sort of think about these things and act. And the CPI is now here working, and we on top of that have now created what we call the Trust Valley, to essentially again do this multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary approach on how we can strengthen trust and traceability and cybersecurity on the digital front. And again, it's very interesting. At the end of the day, I'm persuaded it's very clearly not going to be from only governments that the solution is going to come, but it's neither going to be just the private sector doing it. It's that collaboration, that cooperation, that co-innovation which will drive us forward. I'm very convinced of that, and the conversations we have in, day out on this front give me quite some hope here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I heard Jack Ma at the United UNCTAD, as you know, that does the e-commerce week. I was there. I think the last time I was there was about 3 or 4 years ago. Anyway, Jack Ma in his presentation brought up a similar idea to Brad Smith.
Jack was one of the co-chairs of the high-level panel of the UN on digital cooperation.
Yeah.
Again, public-private working together. The Secretariat was here in Geneva, and we welcomed all of these panelists, and Jack made a great contribution to this. Again, public-private. At the end of the day, that's what we need. But we need indeed to have a proper understanding of how this interplay can work better. I agree with you.
Yeah, there's that. And then in the faith-based world, I don't know that Microsoft and Alibaba are considered faith-based organizations. So no,
not really, no. Or maybe it's another faith.
Yeah, again, in our context, looking for ways, and there may be sub-communities in fact, this decentralized digital world that we're moving into by definition will have multiple streams like that. So there may be broad streams with those massive international global players, and very interesting niches. And, as I know, having worked at Huawei, we had thousands of suppliers, around the world. So even in the world, if it would be largely taken up with the Alibabas and Microsofts, there are all kinds of projects and suppliers and thinkers and ways that technology could be applied in subsectors. So again, really, I think we're all here trying to get some ideas and some inspiration on going forward, because this is definitely an area for action.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I like that. I mean, there's also a kind of a second kind of Stockholm syndrome, which is when the forest preservation of the forests sort of campaign first met in Stockholm in the 70s, I guess, everybody attended it, and Malaysia and other countries came away with the idea, hey, we can make money from the forests, and started chopping them down. So that if we're going to have a network to discuss how to combat, cyber on cybersecurity and other issues, it'll also be the to-go place for how do I do, cyber sort of attacks and things. And so the faith groups themselves will be part of the, if you like, the control mechanism that's saying, we really, we shouldn't be doing that. I mean, in time, like with the forest, the world has more or less got to a kind of a better place on that. But certainly my sense is that we would probably accelerate the problem before we actually take control of the reins and slow things down. Just a risk that's out there. But the faith, in theory at least, should be part of the control mechanism.
Yeah, it's a good thought. I'm imagining as you speak, Michael, children learning how to walk, and of course they always stumble and fall down and need to learn how to walk properly before they can run. But there's comfort in I think the faith community brings and at least in theory and hopefully in practice a higher ethical standard to the entire thing, which would be an area that at least many parties, many communities, and indeed many governments would welcome a proven basis like that.
Everyone, it has been actually a really fascinating conversation. I've learned a lot, and keen to Nicholas, it's great. We'll be hearing more from you later on in the day, but James, this has been fascinating as well. And I hope we can continue to connect and have some of those conversations. As you say, how do we take things forward and find the opportunities and the ideas to hopefully relatively safely try some of these things, and to also reach groups where they are. So where it has to be a conversation on values rather than on faith. And as in the Japanese scenario where you're building up from where people are. Yeah, it's been fascinating to hear from you all. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, James and Nicholas. Thank you.
Back.
Thank you so much to everybody.
Yeah,
thank you.
Appreciate it. Good to talk with all of you.
Thank you.
We're going into a lunch break now, and we will be back in about an hour and a half.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.